Thank you everyone for being here this evening and taking time out of your busy lives to join us and talk about Coffin Butte Landfill and the future of Benton County and waste management a little bit more broadly. My name's Mason Levitt. I work at Beyond Toxics as a GIS and spatial data coordinator, and I want to first off give a big shout out to Crystal Abrams, our communication manager, who's behind the scenes and helping make sure this webinar and everything runs smoothly this evening. I'd also like to give a big shout out and introduction to my co-panelists tonight. Joel and Mark, do you want to come out and say hi and introduce yourselves?
Yeah, hi, I'm Joel Geyer. I am coming to this from a background as a farmer originally growing up, but I studied in mining engineering and wound up specializing in the field of hydrogeology, which is the science of how water moves through rocks and soil. And I have a PhD in the field. I currently work as an independent consultant, mainly on radioactive waste issues. I've worked for Canada, Sweden, France, Finland, Switzerland, UK, and South Korean governments. And I'm also living nearby the landfill, and so I've been involved in the Valley Neighbors for Environmental Quality and Safety, known as VNEX. Mark?
Thanks, Joel, and thanks, Mason, and thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. My name is Mark Yeager, and I am a registered civil and environmental engineer and have been working in the municipal engineering field and specializing in water, wastewater, stormwater, and solid waste management for more than 40 years. I'm a longtime resident of Benton County. Have been living in Benton County for over 40 years as well, and live at the south end of the Soap Creek Valley. The Soap Creek Valley runs up and actually comes out near the landfill. So I'm a sort of a neighbor of the landfill, but not as close as Joel is. So welcome everyone, and look forward to your participation this evening. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm going to start us off with just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk a little bit about Beyond Toxics and why we're here, and then we're going to kick off the presentation. So the webinar style format this evening we're going to go through is I'm going to kick things off, and then we're going to hear from Joel and then Mark covering topics of the landfill. I want you all audience members to get your notebook and pen ready, your Word document and keyboard, or your fingers and your phone and your notes app ready, and to write your questions down as they come. And at the very end, we'll have a Q&A, and there'll be a couple of different styles in which you can either type in your question, or we'll even allow people to raise their hands and unmute and be able to ask their question. This evening, we are recording our Q&A. We want to record the entire meeting as well as the question and answering period, because many of the questions that you all have are likely going to be questions that people have as they watch back on this webinar. So if you submit your questions via the chat, we won't read your name and we'll just ask the question. But if you'd like to raise your hand and ask your question verbally, just a warning, your face or your screen will not be shown on the recording, but your voice will come through. So I'll talk a little bit, I'll give a good reminder for that as we approach the Q&A session. But for now, I am just going to start things off. So as I mentioned, I am with Beyond Toxics, and Beyond Toxics is an environmental justice organization that works across the state of Oregon to help people ensure that we have equitable access to clean water, clean air, and healthy living spaces that are toxic free. We work with communities all over Oregon, as far as Eastern Oregon, as well as in the Rogue Valley and up here in the Willamette Valley. We originally got involved in this as a few members of VNEX, the Valley Neighbors for Environmental Quality and Safety, reached out to us asking to see if there's anything we could do to work with them on stopping an expansion for the landfill. We have been working on waste management, however, for over a decade through working with the community in Brooks near Salem, Oregon, with the Covanta Municipal Solid Waste Incinerator. Often when we talked to people who worked and advocated against incineration of our garbage, their solution was to landfill it all. And then when you talk to people who live near landfills and have to deal with landfills, they say to incinerate it. And so this game of a push and pull, we realized wasn't going to yield long-term benefits for community members. And so our executive director brought both of these communities together so that we can address waste management holistically instead of this push and pull system. So that's a little bit about why Beyond Toxics is involved and what we do. You can find out more at beyondtoxics.org. And Crystal has kindly put a few links in the chat for you all if you're interested in looking at now or later. But enough about that. Let's get into our presentation and the Coffin Butte Landfill for the evening. So we're going to go through this in a few different steps. First, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about Landfills 101. How do they work? What sort of drawbacks do they have, and how are they set up? Then we're going to talk about some of the gas byproducts that come out the top of landfills, and I'll cover that. And then Joel is going to take it away with the liquid byproducts that come out of the bottom of the landfill, also referred to as leachate. And then Mark is going to talk about recent events with Coffin Butte and Benton County, sort of give us a laydown of the history of the landfill itself and some of the recent efforts like the Benton County Talks Trash and Sustainable Materials Management Plan, what those mean, what they don't cover, what the county has control over, and what we may not have a lot of control over. And then we're going to talk about the looming expansion of the landfill and what that might look like. And sort of the process that it's in. So without further ado, let's start with Landfills 101 and with the basics. So this is a picture of Coffin Butte Landfill. You can kind of have a cue of how large it is. This is a full-size semi-truck, and it pales in comparison to what we call sometimes the mountain of garbage. A little bit on how they work. I want you all to close your eyes for just a second and picture a giant Ziploc bag, one the size of a large apartment building or maybe even a little bit bigger. And in that bag, we put and deposit and store garbage. And that is kind of essentially what a landfill is in a nutshell. There are pipes that come out of the top of that bag, and they collect gaseous byproducts that are produced by decomposing garbage. And there are pipes that run along the bottom of that bag that collect and divert moisture before it enters the groundwater and ships it off to somewhere to dispose of it. On here, we have a conceptual model of a landfill that's pretty simple. Often multiple of these plastic bags are sort of wedged together and stacked next to each other, and that's what's called a landfill cell. So in this graphic, you can see a landfill cell. You can see the plastic membrane that lines it and forms that Ziploc bag. And you can also see some of the gravel that's used to stabilize the landfill and so that it's structurally sound and doesn't shift around in the ground a whole lot. Most of the time, landfills also have a clay layer, which is intended to catch any leachate or leaking liquid byproducts before it hits the groundwater or the soil. The important thing to know about these giant plastic bags or landfills is that all of them fail eventually. It's not a question of if the landfill will break and leak, it's a question of when. And many of these plastics and thick membranes are meant to last a long period of time, but they often start to fail along the 3 to 5 decade mark, which is coincidentally when a landfill operator is no longer responsible for the condition of the landfill and its long-term liabilities. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Mark will talk a little bit more about that. What's important for us to know is the general structure. We also have this thing called the working phase, and that is where garbage is actively deposited from trucks that drop it off, and it's compacted with tractors and eventually has a cover put over it. Here we have different pipes coming out of the top, just like I talked about, and they extract what's called landfill gas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the primary ingredients of that in just a second. This landfill gas is then pumped to either a flare, where the flare burns the landfill gas before it enters the atmosphere, or occasionally it is also pumped to some sort of electricity generator that generates electricity. So in the case of Coffin Butte, there is a electric generator that does generate electricity for about 4,000 homes, give or take, according to the organization that runs that generator. And then the rest of the landfill gas is pumped to 3 flares, which then burn it off as it enters the atmosphere. Along the bottom of the landfill, we have that liquid collection system I was talking about. This graphic is a bit of a misnomer in that it says sends leachate to treatment. We're going to sort of complicate what treatment looks like, and it effectively ends up in the Willamette River untreated is sort of the summary, but Joel gets to talk about the specifics of that. So now that we have a conceptual and basic understanding of what a landfill is and how it's structured and how it works, I'm going to talk a little bit about what comes out the top. Landfill gas is primarily composed of methane, or CH4, which is the primary ingredient in natural gas. It also comes out of cows as they digest their food. And the important thing to know about methane is that it is a super climate change polluter. It is 84 more times powerful than a single molecule of carbon dioxide. And so when it comes to thinking about climate change, it's really important that we work with landfills and make sure that we're capturing and preventing the generation of methane. You might wonder, how is methane gas generated in a landfill? When you compact organic waste, such as banana peels and any other types of food waste, or more synthetic varieties like carpet, which are made of a mixture of organic materials and plastics, or treated wood, for example, is another one. All of that compacted waste is put in an oxygenless environment. Because the waste is so tightly packed, there's very little way for oxygen to enter the landfill. And as a result, this creates an anaerobic environment. And in this anaerobic environment, little molecules and bugs come alive, and microbes, and they begin to eat at and digest this organic waste. And when they do that, they produce methane and carbon dioxide. So over here, we have, to kind of illustrate some of the size and scale of this, a total amount of methane that is generated by Oregon's landfills on the right. And then on the left, we have methane emission sources at a nationwide view. In first place, we have natural gas and petroleum systems, which generate an awful lot of methane. And then we have what's called enteric fermentation, which is a fancy word for what happens when cows eat cud and grass and digest it and produce methane. After all, we like our burgers, right? And then following, we have landfill emissions. It should be noted that often the way that landfill emissions are calculated is based on a model or an idea and an equation. Scientists that have flown over landfills and confirmed the amount of methane coming off of them guess, or should give them a little more credit. They claim, not guess, very educated guess, that the way we estimate methane emissions is often an underestimation of the actual amounts of methane that landfills produce. So this graphic in actuality might show that there's a little bit more methane produced by landfills than it demonstrates at this moment because it's based on a model. To give us an idea of how consequential and important this is, I have generated this graphic using data by the Department of Environmental Quality. And so over here, we have Coffin Butte. Up here, we have Riverbend Landfill. We have Roseburg, Short Mountain in Eugene, Dry Creek down in Medford, and Columbia Ridge over here in Gilliam County, which primarily services Portland. Gilliam, or The Columbia Ridge landfill generates about 3.45 million tons of CO2 equivalent and methane. And that might sound like a big number and not really mean a whole lot. Well, when one person flies from Boston to Paris and back on an economy flight, they generate 1 ton of CO2. So this landfill generates 3.45 million tons of CO2 equivalent each year, meaning that to sum up the estimation of Columbia Ridge's methane emissions would be the equivalent global warming effect of transporting 3.45 million people from Boston to Paris and back. So this is not a small number we're talking about. This is not a small contribution to climate change. It's actually quite big. Not to mention, when methane escapes, other things escape with it. So one of the ways that we control this in Oregon is by requiring the landfill operator to walk this landfill. And they do it and then sort of use a little sniffer machine that they bring near the tarp and look for holes in the landfill. And this sniffer will tell the operator how much methane gas is in the air. And in Oregon, landfill operators are legally required to report any leaks of 200 parts per million and or greater. So let's get back to Coffin Butte and what this means for Coffin Butte. Well, Coffin Butte in June of 2022 did their own methane surface emissions monitoring report. And they walked this thin dotted line of the landfill, or at least claimed to walk that thin dotted line of the landfill. Throughout that, they found a total of 6 leaks, the largest of which was 1,300 parts per million. So pretty large. Now they're required to fix any leaks that are greater than 500. So they fixed those leaks and then came back and monitored them 10 days later, as required by Oregon law. And they had fixed those leaks and shown that all of them had fallen below 500 parts per million, and therefore they were in compliance. Well, the Environmental Protection Agency showed up 5 days later in an announced inspection. So Coffin Butte knew that the EPA was going to show up and that they were going to do their own surface emissions monitoring. The EPA inspector walked this thick dotted line that you can see, and they found leaks that were far larger and far more numerous than what Coffin Butte had reported 5 days earlier. So Coffin Butte's leaks all stayed in this range right here, but the EPA found several leaks that were 50,000 to 70,000 parts per million or more, because the machine they were using can't detect anything above 70,000 parts per million. This is really important to note because anything marked in purple is so concentrated in methane that it can be explosive with some sort of external ignition, which in landfills is not uncommon, as there are lithium batteries and other things in landfills that can catch and start fires. In some landfills that Republic Services operates, Republic Services is the parent company that owns Coffin Butte, there are subterranean fires in the bottom of the landfill that have been going on for years. So flammability and causing these types of explosions is not unheard of. So the EPA inspector found huge leaks, and they found a total of about 61. They found so many leaks that they ran out of flags to mark the leaks with. In this graphic, you can see some of these dots are circled. Those are areas where the Environmental Protection Agency found holes, gaps, tears in the tarp, or protruding pieces of equipment like gas extraction wells that should have been monitored by Coffin Butte Landfill 15 days earlier during their initial inspection. So these are pictures on the right and bottom of some of those circled areas. Some of the tears are kind of small and, could be understandable to miss. And then some of them are really large and really hard to miss. And many of them were on the dotted line that the operator had claimed to walk and had inspected. So the Environmental Protection Agency found some pretty egregious leaks and noted several issues with the way that Coffin Butte was conducting their surface emissions monitoring. Now, there are far more objective ways to measure methane than self-reported data. One of these recent inventions is by allowing technologies like satellites or drones to be able to measure methane emissions from space or from the air. And so there was a nonprofit called Carbon Mapper that started a partnership with I believe it was the NOAA to launch the satellite, but it might have been NASA. Correct me sometime in the chat. Anyways, Carbon Mapper works as a partnership between the US government, and they flew over Coffin Butte Landfill in July 2023, 1 year later after this inspection. And they flew over 3 days, July 13th, July 18th, and July 22nd. And each of those moments that they happened to fly over Coffin Butte Landfill, they found a plume of methane escaping the landfill. And many of these plumes are larger than the landfill itself. I'm gonna outline over here to the right. So this is kind of the landfill right here. And then over here is the quarry. So some of these clouds were extremely large and easily detectable from space. The important thing to note about methane escaping is that when methane gas escapes this landfill and impacts the climate, there are other gases that escape with it. In landfills are cleaning products, petroleum contaminated soil, pesticides, paint. Anything that makes it into the landfill can move into a gaseous state. And when there are leaks in the landfill, these chemicals are also escaping. So when people are reporting that the landfill smells really bad, or that the air around the landfill within a 2-mile radius smells really bad, they're often talking about hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotting garbage or rotting eggs. And that's a really well-known byproduct that's a part of landfill gas and this methane escaping. So these issues not only impact the climate and a whole lot of people, but they also impact people who live nearby. To kind of establish this, we walked to each home in Adair Village, a community southeast of the landfill. We were looking at this image over here on the top left. Adair Village would be kind of right down around here relative to this image. And so we walked that community and went to all 496 homes in the area. 126 people answered the door and took a survey. And when asked the question, do they often smell the landfill? 60% of respondents said yes. We then asked, have you on some or multiple occasions modified your daily activities because A, the air smelled so bad you couldn't stand being outside, or B, because the air smelled so bad and you didn't know what was in it, and you might have been afraid for your health or not sure what you were breathing in. 20% of people reported modifying their daily activities around the smell of the landfill, meaning if they were going to walk their dog or garden that day, they chose not to because it smelled so bad. So these consequences are borne by the community nearby and really contribute to a nuisance and an unbearableness to be outside and be around this. So that's kind of a little bit about what comes out of the top of landfills and some of the specifics that we know from governmental agencies about Coffin Butte. With that, I'm going to pass things off to Joel. So if you have questions for me, take a moment, write them down, and get ready for our next speaker who's going to talk a little bit about leachate.
Yeah, thanks, Mason. And there we go. So Mason has talked about the things that come out the top of the landfill. What goes in the top of the landfill either comes out the bottom or out the top and I'll particularly talk about what comes out the bottom, and in particular this thing called leachate, which is really a toxic stew. Another way to think of it, if you're familiar with compost tea, which is where you trickle water down through your compost in the backyard, you get what comes out in the bottom, which in the case of compost tea has a lot of nutrients. But in the case of a landfill, what comes out the bottom of this more toxic form of stew is really a contaminated liquid that has a lot of serious issues. So if we can go to the next slide there. And just to understand this, Mason already mentioned a few of these things, but what the problems arise from what goes into the landfill. And this is just a few of the things that commonly go into municipal waste landfills like Coffin Butte. At the top left, there's the pesticides, whether it's wasp killer or ant killer, or garden chemicals that people spray on there to kill weeds, slug bait, and so on. And these things are not supposed to go in the landfill, but we all know that if you use a aerosol can full of one of these things, probably not all of it gets used up. So there's some left in the bottom, or people might have cans of it. They have to deal with a relative's estate or something, and they need to take it somewhere. And there is a proper place to take all these pesticides, which is to toxic waste take back events. But the problem is those things only happen 2 or 3 times a year, and they're only really accessible to people that have vehicles to go to them with, and also places to store those chemicals in the meantime. So we know if you're living in an apartment or you just don't have a lot of room in your house, a lot of these things you're going to end up wanting to deal with sooner. And unfortunately, the common thing people do is just toss it into the garbage. And probably 1 or 2 cans of this won't make a big difference. But if you think of hundreds of thousands of people all doing this and sending it to the landfill, it ends up being a pretty big amount of these toxic chemicals that are left going into the landfill. And then the emerging thing that we're seeing is electronics waste. Again, this isn't supposed to go into the landfill. There's work on recycling programs to capture these and keep them out. But again, a lot of consumer electronics wind up going into the trash. And these have, in particular, they have a lot of lead and other exotic metals like cadmium. But there are really literally thousands, more than 1,000 types of dangerous chemicals have been identified that can come out of electronic waste when it's leached in a landfill type environment, including dioxins. And then there's pharmaceuticals. Fortunately, I think a lot of people have been getting the message that you shouldn't be flushing these down the toilet, because we know that even when they go into waterways, they cause problems for aquatic life, things as bad as frogs growing extra legs, fish developing growths on them. So people have learned and that they shouldn't do that, but what else can they do with them? So a lot of them wind up going into the landfills again. There's pharmaceutical take-back events, but not many people know about these. They're difficult to get to, and so a lot of this goes into landfills also. And personal care products. This is a category that covers everything from hairspray to shampoo to dietary supplements. I don't know if you've ever read the shampoo bottle labels, you know there's some things in there that are not normal to find in the environment. And again, in small concentrations, they might not be particularly dangerous if you just are shampooing once a day, but when you're building up piles and piles of these in the landfill, they can become a problem. And down at the bottom, there's food waste, which thankfully is not toxic, but this is one of the biggest sources of methane as it breaks down organics like this, as Mason mentioned. And there's a few other things that don't actually aren't included in that last slide. Things like human and animal feces, think of cat litter boxes, dog poop bags, poopy diapers. And then at Coffin Butte in particular, there's other things that get brought in, contaminated soils. Anytime that a gasoline truck or a diesel truck drives into the ditch and spills its load, all that contaminated soil, has happened north of Adair Village just 5 years ago, ends up just being scooped up and hauled up to the landfill. In other cases, there have been sites that are contaminated with, where the soil is contaminated with dioxins, such as the old consumer power facility on Circle Drive in Corvallis. And that dirt was also hauled up and dumped on top of the landfill. And there's another thing called alternative daily cover, which it turns out that for Coffin Butte, that includes ash from the Covanta incinerator, which is what Marion County uses to burn their garbage. They end up with tons and tons of ash that has concentrated all of these, especially the heavy metals that are in the municipal garbage. They're concentrated into this ash, which is then used and allowed to be used actually to cover up the daily garbage that gets hauled in. So all these things are coming to the landfill, and then this diagram here shows what happens next. So you think of this big pile of all those things mixed together, possibly with some contaminated soil thrown on top. And this is out in the elements at first. As Mason mentioned, there's the thing called the working phase. So initially there's not even a plastic liner over the top of this. And so any rain that's falling down is going to percolate down into that pile of garbage. Also at the same time, volatile gases, so VOCs, that's volatile organic compounds, so things like gasoline vapors, can rise out through the top of this, and also the other landfill generated gases, like methane. But as the water percolates into this pile of garbage, it starts to activate bacteria and also chemical processes, chemical reactions and these chemical reactions actually turn the water more acidic, which means that it's more able to dissolve out metals that are in things like the electronic waste. And it's also able to dissolve the nutrients that are in the organic waste that's in there, including all those poopy diapers and cat litter. And those things, then we've got the green ends that represents the nutrients here, and the metals, the M's, those are going to sink down with the water as it percolates down through this pile, and it just picks up more and more as it gets down towards the bottom. Now, in the properly run system, as long as that bottom liner is intact and they have a working landfill, the leachate that forms, this is what we call leachate, then it gets piped out of the landfill and sent off to leachate ponds and then to trucks which haul it hopefully to a treatment facility. We'll be talking about those, what we call treatment facilities. Should put captions on those, because there isn't really much treatment that happens. But what we do know is also there's usually some leakage that comes out the side of landfills. This has happened for an unknown number of years at Coffin Butte, for example. In the 1990s, there's an acknowledged seepage incident where leachate came out of the side of the landfill, wound up in surface runoff in streamways, and was carried downstream that way. Also, there's in parts of the landfill, there are no liners at all. So already leachate was, even according to the initial design, leachate was allowed to sink down into the soils underneath. And the other thing that can happen, as Mason mentioned, is eventually liners do fail. And usually this happens along seams. They're very thick plastic. It looks impressive when you see it presented, but there's always a weak point. And when you think of all the tons of garbage burning down on this with all sorts of sharp metal objects, old equipment, it's not homogeneous, which means the loads are distributed unevenly. There are going to be pressure points where that liner is actually eventually going to fail, both due to mechanical and to chemical processes. And when that happens, then there's leakage out the bottom and percolation into the soil layer beneath. As Mason mentioned, a lot of landfills have a clay layer underneath, which helps to absorb and retard that leachate from penetrating deeper into the ground. Clay is a really good material for stopping this. It tends to swell up when it gets wet and seal itself off, and it becomes really a strong barrier to migration. But Coffin Butte doesn't have any such layer. And so the leachate, when it does leak, can go directly into the ground and form a leachate plume, like is exhibited here. And then at that point, it moves more or less downhill in the direction of the hydraulic gradient. The other thing about Coffin Butte is that it's built in a very wet climate. We have a very high water table. So here, even though it shows leachate moving through the soil above the groundwater table, in our location, what really happens is that any contamination goes pretty quickly into the groundwater, and then it's carried off in the direction that groundwater is moving, which in the case of Coffin Butte is probably in the direction towards the nearest creek or river. And it happens that Coffin Butte is in a bend where Soap Creek bends around, so it can go in both directions, either to the west towards Upper Soap Creek, or to the east towards the lower part of Soap Creek into the Luckmute River and eventually into the Willamette River. And what does end up in the soil, the diagram also shows there are places where humans can be exposed. There's soil pollution, contaminants going into waterways that end up in fish that might be consumed by people. And in a rural area like around Coffin Butte, there are a lot of homes that rely on water wells for their drinking water. And so that becomes another uptake pathway where people have their drinking water drawn from a well that is down in that contaminated plume. So these are sort of all the risks and ways that contaminants can get out of the landfill through the bottom. And if we go to the next slide. Remember I said that we hope that this doesn't happen for some time, but in the meantime, there's also the leachate that's actually being sucked out of this landfill, pumped out the bottom through pipes according to the system if it's working properly, and that has to go somewhere. The map on the left shows a series of dots that show where leachate is being generated in the Willamette Valley. This is a map of the Willamette River watershed from Eugene down there at the bottom. You can see in the south flowing up all the way to Portland, and then some of the tributaries of the Willamette River. So where you have a brown dot on this, there's I think 5 of them. There's the up by Eugene, there's the Short Mountain landfill, which is owned as a municipal landfill run by Lane County. And then near Corvallis, there's the Coffin Butte landfill about midway up the valley, what we call the Mid-Willamette Valley. And then there's also the Riverbend landfill up in Yamhill County, which is in the process of closing, but not fully closed yet. And that's on the Yamhill River. And then there's farther up the in Hillsborough, there's the Hillsborough landfill, which takes mainly construction waste and special waste, they call it. And that is still operating. So each of these is producing leachate, which has to be hauled to someplace. And in Eugene, that means they haul it in semi-trucks down to the Eugene Springfield wastewater treatment plant. And Mark may talk more about this, but wastewater treatment plants are not really designed to deal with landfill leachate and all the various toxins that are in there, the heavy metals. They're really designed to deal with household sewage, the kind of things that you do flush down your toilet and through your kitchen sink and through your garbage disposal. And these are mostly organic waste that is thought to settle out in the treatment process. But a lot of these compounds, the dissolved heavy metals, things like lead, cadmium, and arsenic is another big one, are not handled by these treatment plants. And also some of the other things I'm going to talk about, the emerging contaminants like PFAS, which will be on the next slide. So anyway, it goes into this treatment plant, it gets passed through, and the effluent then goes into the river. At the Corvallis wastewater treatment plant, that takes half of the leachate from Coffin Butte landfill. The same thing happens. That's the next orange dot up the river. And some of that, because Coffin Butte produces so much leachate, half of it is hauled to Corvallis and half gets hauled to the Salem wastewater treatment plant. It's about 15 million gallons a year going to each one of those treatment plants. And each of them has a real similar process that doesn't really get out most of the compounds that are in the landfill leachate. And farther down the river, Riverbend landfill is also currently shipping leachate to the Salem wastewater treatment plant, but they also send it to the Hillsborough wastewater treatment plant, which receives also leachate from Hillsborough landfill. And it turns out we learned through this project that way up by Tacoma, there's a plant near Puyallup, actually Washington, that is also trucking leachate down I-5 to put into the Salem wastewater treatment plant. We may wonder why they're trucking it so far and what perhaps the state of Washington knows that we haven't picked up on yet in Oregon, but for some reason they're actually trucking it down I-5 and then paying to have it disposed of in the Salem wastewater treatment plant. And then finally, there's also the Columbia Boulevard wastewater treatment plant in Portland, which is receiving wastewater from leachate from the North Marion County landfill. So this is going into the Willamette River. And one particular thing of concern is that all of these things are upstream of somebody's drinking water supply. So in the case of the Eugene wastewater treatment plant receiving leachate from Short Mountain, this is upstream of the Corvallis water intake for the city's water supply that supplies most of the water for the city of Corvallis. They also get some from Rock Creek. When leachate comes to the Corvallis wastewater treatment plant, just downstream of that, it goes in just a few river miles upstream of Adair Village, that's a growing town that it has some hundreds of households. And then anything that goes into the Salem wastewater treatment plant is upstream of the water intakes for Wilsonville, Tualatin Valley, and city of Sherwood. And also, in addition to these things, it's not just water supplies, but people are recreating in these rivers, and in particular, people that rely on fish as part of their diet that are fishing from these rivers. And that's particularly an issue for First Nations that have cultural a need for salmon and eels that are harvested from traditional gathering places like Willamette Falls. So in particular, First Nations may be at the highest risk, because what's been found is that these compounds that are in the leachate tend to accumulate in species that are higher up the food chain, like salmon and like these eels. So yeah, the diagram on the right just shows the situation with the Coffin Butte landfill taking water just thankfully below the Corvallis water intake, but just above the water intake for Adair Village. Go to the next slide. And this just illustrates, for one particular class of chemicals that are particularly of danger, how wastewater treatment plants don't actually solve the problem. They're not actually removing the contaminants of concern. So this particular class of chemicals is called, some people just call them forever chemicals. They're PFAS is the abbreviation, and the key thing in there is the F, which is fluorinated compounds. And there's a whole universe of these compounds that have been developed for all sorts of things. Scotchgard was one of them. Anything that has the remarkable property of shedding water and repelling water. Think of Teflon on your Teflon cooking pans, but also especially firefighting foam and things like waterproof clothing, the repellents that are used on those. These are extremely stable. They have some unique properties that turn out to be good for consumer uses, but terrible in terms of environmental situation, because they just do not break down. It's even turned out recently, the latest news is that they're showing up in sea foam. They go into their waterways, they make it out to the ocean, and they come splashing up in ocean spray, to the point where communities like Yaquina Bay out on the coast can actually be receiving pretty high doses of these chemicals through the spray that's coming off the ocean because of past contamination of waterways. But anyway, there's emerging awareness on how these are problematic, and there's now a move to restrict them. This graph includes some progress on that. There's some, what I'll talk about first, though, is just the amount that's coming off in landfill leachate. So that's the red bars. And when you compare that to municipal wastewater, it's known that these chemicals are pretty much everywhere. They're ubiquitous. Oops, let's go back. Yeah, they're ubiquitous, especially in consumer products. So they do show up in municipal wastewater. The good news is that with the legislation that's in the works, there's a move to restrict these in consumer products. Many of these are already being phased out. And so we can expect that those concentrations in municipal wastewaters will go down over time. But then look at the red bars for landfill leachate. A couple of them on the top are actually off the scale of this plot. But generally they're high, very high compared to what's in municipal wastewater. And the other thing about landfill leachate is that it gets generated for a long time. Effectively, landfills will keep generating leachate almost forever, for decades. So you can think of landfills as a forever source of forever chemicals. And so this is going to be a continuing problem. And what you see is that when they bring this into the into the wastewater treatment plants, again, they're mixing it in, trickling it in with the municipal wastewater. And then the black bars show what's actually coming out. And what you see is that what's coming out of the treatment plants is actually higher than what's coming in from the municipal wastewater. So it's actually getting worse as it goes through the treatment plants. The landfills, leachate may be a big part of that problem. There are also some ways that some of these PFAS chemicals can be generated from what's called precursor chemicals that come in municipal wastewater. But clearly having all of this coming in as a huge load from the landfill leachate is not a good thing. And it's making the ultimate pollution of the Willamette River worse. The other thing you can see in here are some dotted lines in sort of small print. They say EPA proposed drinking water limit. These are now actually not proposed drinking water limits. These are actual mandated. I think this news just came out last month or within the last 3 or 4 weeks. These are now a matter of law. So communities that have drinking water supplies, whether it's a local trailer court or a large city, they're going to have to ensure that the residents who are drinking water are not getting PFAS contaminants above these levels, or otherwise they'll be subject to federal fines. So this means that what's going into the Willamette River is potentially creating a problem for all of these communities that draw their drinking water from the river downstream of these wastewater treatment plants. And that problem can only be made worse by having the leachate going in there. So that's, I think, the next slide, and I will be turning it over to Mark now. And you might think, with all those problems coming from the landfill, why would we not just want to cap it where it is? But it turns out that there is a move to expand it. So Mark will talk about that.
Thank you, Joel. And again, welcome everybody. Appreciate your time this evening. You can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Mason. So I'm gonna, on this first slide, I'm gonna talk about 3 different things. I'm gonna talk about the history of this particular landfill, both in terms of ownership of the landfill and also the land use history. I'm also going to help you understand graphically where all the waste is coming from that ends up in Coffin Butte Landfill. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the volume of waste that's been discharged into the landfill over time. So first of all, from a historic standpoint, this landfill was created as a open burning dump in 1942 as part of the Camp Adair development, when they had the Camp Adair Air Force facilities located at Adair. They needed some place to take their waste. They also had done some excavation to find rock to build roads and things like that. So the hole that they dug to get rock was a good place to put their garbage at the time. So for a long time, that site was owned by the government. In 1952, property was purchased by a local company out of Salem, actually, and they owned that property from 1952 to 2000. And in 2000, then the land was purchased by Allied Waste, a large landfill garbage company, and was owned by Allied Waste from 2000 to 2008. And then in 2008, Republic Services purchased Allied Waste. And so as a result, Republic Services now is currently the property owner for the landfill site, although it's technically owned by a subsidiary corporation of Republic Services called Valley Landfills. From a land use perspective, so back in 1942, it was just sort of a dumping site that was pretty convenient for folks. It sort of got operated as one of many, many landfill sites that were occurring throughout the Willamette Valley back in the 50s and 60s. And there was a process that was put together because people realized that landfills weren't, particularly back then when they weren't lined at all, that they were not very good for water quality, air quality, all kinds of things. So in 1974, there was a process in the Mid-Willamette Valley that ended up choosing Coffin Butte as the designated regional landfill. However, when it was designated in 1974, there were very strong objections to people who understood that this is not a good location for a landfill because of all the things that Joel talked about earlier. And even though people objected, it was designated as a regional landfill. However, it was designed and specifically focused on a very small area that was going to be taking their waste to Coffin Butte. Then in 1983, the county, the owner at the time, the local owner, approached the county about changing the zoning to create a zoning for landfill site that was designed to recognize that this property, which was previously zoned as forest conservation, had now become a dump. And so let's create a zone, and they did, called landfill site zone, where it was a designated location for putting garbage. So that happened in 1983. So they created the landfill site zone, but it was a very specific area, and it was also focused on providing service to a limited number of counties. And then in 1994, there was an effort to expand the landfill and to also rezone some of the rural residential property adjacent to the landfill in order to have a larger area. And that rezoning and expansion was initially approved by the Benton County Planning Commission. It was subsequently appealed, and then the owners at the time withdrew that application, and so it never got approved. And then in 2021, there was a proposal submitted by Republic Services / Valley Landfills to expand the landfill across Coffin Butte Road to the south. And I'll show you a map in just a second that highlights those areas so you can get a visual picture of it. However, there was very vociferous objections to that. There was hours and hours of testimony, and not only verbal but written testimony. That expansion proposal was unanimously rejected by the Planning Commission. That decision was also initially appealed to the Board of Commissioners by Republic Services, and ultimately they withdrew that appeal. And out of that process, the county decided that maybe we should listen to what people have to say about concerns related to the landfill. And so they created what was called the Benton County Talks Trash Work Group. This was a very large work group that was populated by some members of the community, but mostly by there were a lot of members of Republic Services on that group, and the specific issues associated with the landfill weren't part of that discussion. So what ended up happening in terms of that Benton County Talks Trash process was it resulted in I think, a very effective gathering of background and information related to the history of the landfill, and raised a lot of questions relative to land use issues and some legal issues. And it produced a over 1,000-page report with dozens and dozens of recommendations. So that process exists. You can find that on the county's website. And one of the recommendations that came out of that process, the only one that the county has decided to attempt to move forward with, was a recommendation to develop a sustainable materials management plan. And what initially was envisioned, I think, as a method to try to help us understand how can we more effectively manage our waste. That process now, they have created the Benton County has created and will soon convene in Salem a committee of 45 members representing many counties as far south as Klamath County, and all over the western part of Oregon. With I'm not sure what the final objectives are. However, what appears to be happening is there is not going to be any discussion of what is the future for the Coffin Butte landfill site, or in fact, what are the alternatives to continuing to place waste in a location that is not appropriate from an environmental and geologic standpoint. So we also have been told by the county staff that they expect in 2024 that Republic Services will once again be approaching the county to get a conditional use permit to expand the landfill. We don't know exactly what that expansion proposal will look like, but we've been told that it is imminent. So let's talk a little bit and focus on the right side of this slide to show you the distribution of areas where waste is coming to the Coffin Butte landfill. So every one of the counties that has their name associated with it, there is waste coming from those counties. So as far away as Malheur County and Klamath County, also up into Pierce County. So we have 4 counties in Washington that are bringing waste. Coos County, Josephine County. So we have waste coming from mostly all over Oregon. Now, the concentration of waste is shown by the different shades of colors. So we are, in fact, serving through Coffin Butte essentially all of Western Oregon now. You know, the South Coast and things, there's some waste coming from there, but not as much. But the initial vision of this landfill as a landfill to serve a handful of counties, Marion County, Lynn County, Polk County, counties adjacent to this landfill, that concept has exploded into receiving waste from all over Western Oregon. And then in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, you can see how the volume of waste has varied over time. So for quite a long period of time, from the mid-90s up until the mid-2000s, there was 400,000 or 500,000 tons of waste coming to the landfill. And then beginning in 2016, we have a dramatic rise in the volume of waste that's coming to the landfill, doubling essentially what was the routine amount of waste that was coming to the landfill, thereby shortening the life of the existing footprint of the landfill. Next slide, please. So just to try to get you oriented a little bit here, there's a couple things that I would like to point out. So up in the upper right-hand corner again is a photo of the landfill itself. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that there are different colored areas. These are areas that represent the different types of land uses that are adjacent to the landfill. So you have blue represents rural residential property, green represents forest conservation property, the beige color is exclusive farm use land, and then the red area are areas that are zoned landfill site. Now, the black dashed line that is outlined on this picture, that shows you all the land that is currently owned by the operator of the landfill, Republic Services. So what is happening now, some of you may have noticed that there there's a lot of activity happening at the quarry. So the Republic Services is working with Knife River to fast track the excavation of rock from the quarry. They are sending dozens and dozens of trucks filled with rock every day from this quarry along Campadare Road, Independence Highway, Highway 20, and this rock is being stockpiled in a quarry site that's midway between Albany and Corvallis. Because their plan at the moment, as far as we can tell, is they're thinking they're going to start constructing a new cell in the quarry area for placement of waste. Now, that is not the proposed expansion area. The area that's shown here, again, on the left-hand side of the page that's highlighted as proposed expansion, that represents the proposed expansion that was proposed in 2021. We do not know, we have no indication yet as to what Republic Services and the county are going to be proposing for expanding the landfill in 2024. But what ends up happening is that once an expansion is approved, so I showed you on the previous page the graph that showed the amount of waste that's coming in. One of the things that is sort of bumping up to in that in the most recent amount of garbage that's coming to the landfill is the current franchise agreement between the county and the operator limits the amount of waste that can be brought into this landfill at 1.1 million tons per year. If a proposed expansion is approved, the franchise agreement states clearly that that tonnage cap, the limit of 1.1 million tons, will be removed. So we really don't have any idea how much waste will actually be coming into the landfill should there be an approval of a proposed expansion. Next slide, please. This is a graphic representation of what was proposed again in 2021. So on the left-hand side of the page is an area that represents the existing sort of boundary just to the left. So the peak there is an area that sort of borders on the rural residential property that is farther to the left. And then on the right-hand side of this graph shows you the extent of the existing landfill grade. What the what Republic Services had proposed in that in the 2021 expansion was that they were going to essentially fill from hillside to hillside. You can see that we've tried to show graphically how high this mountain of garbage was proposed to be at 270 feet tall, and that it also would have filled in Coffin Butte Road. You can see in the middle of the page the graphic showing a car and where the existing Coffin Butte Road bed currently is located. And so just again, for graphical representations, how big is this? The graphic on the left-hand side of the Statue of Liberty shows you how tall the waste mountain was proposed to be. And next to the Statue of Liberty is our own Benton County Courthouse. So it gives you some perspective with regard to the size of what is happening there, or what was proposed to be happening. And again, we don't have any firsthand knowledge as to whether or not this is what will be proposed again in this imminent expansion proposal, but this gives you some perspective on what was proposed previously. All right, next slide, please. So I want to spend my last slide talking a little bit about long-term liability. As you, I think, have understood based on some of the previous presentation, landfills are not designed to last forever. They have ongoing maintenance and operational aspects even once they are closed. So all closed landfills require maintenance. Particularly, they continue to produce gas, the methane gas and other gases, and they also continue to produce leachate. So we have at this landfill, there are two unlined cells existing. Remember, this facility began accepting waste back in the 40s. The requirements to put liners in didn't come in until the mid 90s. There are two existing unlined cells, cell 1 and 1A, that were closed in the late 1970s, so almost 50 years ago, and they are still generating over 2 million gallons of leachate a year. So all landfills leak. They're either leaking now, like in the case of Coffin Butte, where we have methane leaks. We also have these unlined cells where they are collecting leachate, but there's no liner underneath those leachates, underneath those cells. So leachate is also leaking into the groundwater. What ends up happening as part of the rules that were adopted in the 90s, the state and federal requirements require the landfill operators to provide financial assurance that they have enough resources to close the landfill and then to operate the landfill for only 30 years in what's called the post-closure state. Now, the key here is that the estimates for the cost of closure and cost of post-closure, those estimates are self-generated by the landfill operator. There's not an independent audit that says, oh, that's enough money. There's not a process to question. They have to submit those documents to DEQ, but the DEQ, I've looked at the closure and post-closure plans for Coffin Butte. They do not represent the real cost for what's going to happen with the landfill. And again, they only offer some financial assurance for limited operations for 30 years. We also have to remember that in this case, Valley Landfills is a subsidiary corporation of Republic Services. So even though Republic Services is the parent company, Valley Landfills has the liability and has the requirement to provide the financial assurance for these post-closure and closure costs. You are probably aware that it is a fairly common occurrence now for corporations when they get into trouble with regard to things costing more or liabilities showing up, they very quickly declared bankruptcy, and whoops, that part of our company no longer, we don't have any liability for it. So even though there are other federal and state requirements, there's not a lot of assurance in my view. Now, the local franchise agreement that we have with Republic Services, Valley Landfills, requires them to provide two things to help us with what might be future liability associated with the landfill. One is what's called an environmental trust fund, which was, again, created in the 1990s. It was initially targeted to collect revenues as a percentage of the tipping fees at the landfill. And the target was to get to $5 million. So over a few years, they gathered enough money. They got to $5 million, and then that money has been invested and now represents about $15 million in the environmental trust fund that is going to be supposedly available for any sort of future liability associated with the landfill. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, it shows you what just one of Republic Services' existing landfills in Missouri, the Bridgerton landfill, what Republic Services has declared in their public stock statements. People who own stock in public companies, the companies are required to report future or potential liabilities. So this Bridgerton landfill the company's own estimate of the liability, meaning that it might impact future earnings for the company, is nearly $140 million. So, when we think about, oh, well, okay, we've got 5 or 10 or $15 million in this environmental trust fund, it pales in comparison to what the future liabilities might be. Remembering that the waste that has been, there's over 26 million cubic yards of material that has been deposited into this landfill over its life. And during that life, there were lots of chemicals. There's many chemicals that we've banned over time that have been deposited into that landfill. We no longer use them anymore, but they were quite prevalent, and I'm sure there's lots of those in that landfill now. So future liability might be very high. The one other item that is included in the local franchise agreement is what's called pollution liability insurance. And the pollution liability insurance clauses in the 2020 franchise agreement are very interestingly worded, because it says that the landfill operator is required to get $10 million worth of pollution liability insurance as a condition of them being granted a franchise to operate this facility. However, in the very next clause of the franchise agreement, it states that with 30 days notice, the landfill operator can cancel that insurance if, in the view of the operator, the cost of the insurance is too high. So they can just simply say, well, it's no longer available to us at an affordable price, so we are hereby canceling it. And there's nothing that the county can do, because that clause is part of the landfill franchise agreement. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to talk about now. And that leaves us a little time for some questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much. You got through it. So now we're going to open up to questions, as I'm sure that you all have many. The way this is going to work is you're going to be allowed to submit questions a couple of different ways, as we talked about at the beginning. One, you can put your question in writing in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom user interface, which Crystal is going to open up shortly if she hasn't already. Looks like it's all good to go. In there, you may type your question and we'll answer it. Alternatively, you may raise your hand using the Zoom function also at the bottom of your user interface. You can unmute and then ask your question. Try and keep things as a question and not a statement, and please, so that we can allow as many people to ask them as possible, keep your question concise and to the point. If you do choose to raise your hand and unmute yourself, your audio will be a part of the recording, but not your camera or visual at all. So with that being said, I'm going to monitor the Q&A, and we're going to keep an eye out for some folks with raised hands. And Crystal will allow you to unmute yourself, and we'll answer the question as best we can. All right, so we have, first off, I'm gonna take a question in chat, and then John, I'll take your raised hand. First off, we have a question in chat that might be for Joel. Have leachate contaminants been detected in well water of Coffin Butte neighbors?
Yeah, there's been actually no testing that I'm aware of there's one case. It was called the Helms family well, where they actually their well became contaminated with volatile organic compounds, and these are on the west side of the landfill. And they were living there using water for their vegetable garden and for their household. And it was found out in I believe in the 1990s, that they had high levels of TCE and DCE, I think were the chemicals, trichloroethylene. And these are common solvents. They were supplied with a carbon filtering system by the landfill operators at the time, but it didn't turn out to be, it was sufficient for their drinking water, but it couldn't handle, I believe, their garden. And eventually they wound up selling out to the landfill, their property. And for the state, this was seen as a good solution, that one way to control human exposure pathways is to move the humans out of there. So basically the solution was to have the landfill company buy this, and the people moved away to other states, and that well is no longer used. There are other wells on other sides of the landfill that have not been tested so far as I know. We do know that there were high arsenic contamination found in the company's own monitoring wells back in the 1990s. And these were initially ascribed to leachate seeping out of the side of the landfill. The extent to which that traveled is unknown. There hasn't been any testing that I know of farther out off of the landfill property. And this is something that would be a good question to address.
Joel, I'm going to have you quickly answer a related question. Should those of us with private wells near the landfill be concerned about the safety of our water at this time?
I think that my suggestion is that the Department of Environmental Quality should be proactively sampling those wells for the most expected contaminants. And I would say the most at risk is within a mile of the landfill, and within waterways that drain out from the landfill. So it can be quite expensive to do your own testing for some of the compounds that could be out there. So really, this is something that the state really should be taking up as their mandate.
Mark, I know you had something.
I was just going to jump in there to supplement what Joel said. You see on this graphic that all of the area that is bound by the heavy black dashed line, this acquisition of massive amounts of property was a direct result of the recommendation that came out from DEQ as part of the closure of the Helm well. They basically said, you should proactively acquire lots of land around this facility. And again, as Joel said, that was the solution, is to move the humans out rather than actually solving the problem.
All right, thank you. And thanks for your patience, John. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question at this time.
Yes, thank you. I was actually going to ask about this map. I was going to ask Mark if he could just clarify the location of a few things here. But I think I may have figured it out. The straight edge of the black dotted line on the southwest corner, I think that looks like Tampico Road, if I'm correct. And just please correct me if I'm not. And then I also wanted to ask if you could just repeat and clarify what Valley Landfill has been doing in the quarry area, and which is it, the quarry area or the area labeled proposed expansion that you anticipate that there's probably an imminent request to expand into? Which of those areas? Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your questions. And yes, I can confirm that the southwest corner, that straight line, that is Tampico Road there. Actually, I think in that particular location, it's probably called Berry Creek Road, but the extension of Tampico Road as it heads out toward Airlie. So that is Mason. Can you highlight that or take your cursor over there? Yeah, that no, to the left. There you go. That is Tampico Road or Berry Creek Road. So yes, that is the boundary there. And then in terms of what's happening with the quarry, So the county believes that valley landfills can expand into the quarry without getting a permit. And so what they are doing is, I think, double pronged. They are working furiously to remove all of the rock from the quarry area so that they can begin developing a new cell in the quarry area. I think that's probably because they're not sure what the timeline and process will result in for any proposed expansion. So what the landfill has said is that they are running out of space rapidly. And you can see by the other graph where they have dramatically ramped up the amount of garbage that's coming to the landfill. What they had, I mean, if you go back and look at the annual reports from the landfill, just a couple years ago, they said they had 18 or 20 years of life left in the existing cell, not moving into the quarry. But they've brought in so much waste that they're filling up their current DEQ permitted space. And so they are excavating the quarry to move in there probably first before they move into any proposed expansion area. The proposed expansion area, anywhere south of Coffin Butte Road, the area that is here labeled as proposed expansion, explicitly requires a conditional use permit. The quarry area also requires a conditional use permit, but the county is currently maintaining that conditional use permit was issued in 1974, and they have not produced that document to demonstrate that, in fact, the land use requirements or the land use approvals for the quarry have actually been issued. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to run through a couple of questions in the chat. First up, we have, what is the EPA doing about the leaks they discovered at Coffin Butte? How do they generally address ongoing leaks like this? We've reached out to them to sort of ask some of these questions, and it's their policy that they do not comment on ongoing investigations. But what we do know is that the EPA has declared landfills a priority source for 2024, meaning that they are going to take extra efforts to figure out how to address some of these problems and figure out ways to better monitor and capture methane and prevent issues like this. So Coffin Butte wasn't the only landfill that was sampled like we had talked about. They also went to Wasco County landfill in Oregon, as well as Finley Butte, which is out near Pendleton Boardman area, and found similarly disturbing results. So I think we're still kind of in the process of seeing how the EPA chooses to respond to these issues. But that was kind of one of the steps that they have taken so far.
Yeah, I wouldn't just take a chance to clarify what my answer I gave. The question about resources for well testing, I would recommend OSU Extension. They can test for common contaminants. And one of the most common things to come out of landfills in leachate is arsenic. We know there's very high arsenic levels around, especially on the east side of the landfill in their own monitoring wells. There's some argument about the source of that, but this is something that it can be a problem in some wells in the Willamette Valley. So Oregon State University Extension, OSU Extension, does offer well testing at really discounted prices, and they could be asked if they could test for arsenic.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there as well, Joel, because one of the, if you will, one of the indicator constituents that you can use if you're concerned about your well water, you can have the well water tested for total dissolved solids, which is it's a relatively inexpensive test, and high levels of total dissolved solids generally indicates that you've got some different contaminants in your well water. that might then spur you on to do further testing to try to figure out how come my total dissolved solids level is so high. So that's also an approach. It could be a stepwise approach, testing first. And I don't know if I assume that that the extension office can test for total dissolved solids, but that would be something to do as a stepwise approach.
All right, Mark, I'm gonna throw a couple of related questions to you, and hopefully you can give a good picture that I think is going to answer a lot of these. So first off, how do we close the landfill? Second of all, there are questions of how is this expansion decided? Is it by a vote? Is it by something else? And what sort of control does Benton County have over the operation of the landfill? Can they restrict the sources of garbage? And how do they respond to an expansion?
Okay, well, those are some very good questions, and you combine some big questions there. I'm going to set aside for the moment how do we close the landfill, and I will answer first a couple of the other questions. The question about what control does Benton County have over where the waste can come from? The answer to that question is none. So what I mean by that is that there is a Supreme Court decision that that restricts the ability of Benton County. In this case, it's not about Benton County, but in this case, people like the property owners who are concerned about waste coming from lots of places. The interstate commerce laws, in fact, limit the county's ability to restrict where the waste comes from. The county had an opportunity when they negotiated their 2020 franchise agreement to limit the amount of waste, but the geographic distribution cannot be controlled by the county through a franchise agreement. However, Republic Services / Valley Landfill could voluntarily do that if they, in fact, they were running out of space, but they obviously haven't chosen to do that. The process or the area where Benton County does have control is the land use process that is required to expand the landfill. So just like what happened in 2021, the proposed expansion to expand the area south of Coffin Butte Road for the placement of waste, which is currently prohibited. It required the landfill operator to procure a conditional use permit. That is a land use process whereby the applicant, in this case Valley Landfills, had to demonstrate that this incompatible land use could be allowed in this area. And through that months-long process, 6 or 8 month long process, that's when, contrary to the recommendations submitted to the Planning Commission by Benton County staff, which Benton County staff recommended approval of the expansion, the Planning Commission unanimously denied that expansion because they created findings and didn't feel as if the proposal met the requirements for the land use approval. So that is one area of control that the county has with regard to expansion of the landfill. The county also does not have any control over the environmental aspects of the landfill. That is solely the responsibility of EPA, DEQ, the environmental government environmental organizations that issue the solid waste permit, the stormwater permit. They have different types of permits that they have to get to operate that facility. For example, so the county doesn't have any direct control over environmental aspects. However, the land use process, they could do some more, if you will, they could require things like screening and stuff like that. In fact, some of the prior land use decisions whereby they imposed conditions, those are not being enforced by the county, and they could enforce them if they wanted to, but they've chosen not to. I think I answered most of those questions, Mason, with the exception of how do we close the landfill? And so, we do not have any direct authority to close the landfill. Expansions of the landfill, both into the quarry and into some proposed expansion area, there are land use proceedings that the public can use to express their opinion. There will not be any vote. It's not a public vote process. It is an advisory commission that is appointed by the Benton County commissioners, the planning commission, that will first receive any application, and they will make a recommendation, approval or denial. And then the losing party has the opportunity to appeal that decision to the next level, which would be the Board of Commissioners. So I will say that many members of the former planning commission that unanimously denied the previous application are no longer serving on the planning commission. And there is essentially a brand new body of commissioners that have been appointed by the Benton County Board of Commissioners to serve on the planning commission. Hopefully that's not too long-winded.
I don't think there's a short one. All right, so another person asks, when we smell the dump days near the landfill, what is in the air we are smelling? I can't definitively answer this question. There's quite a lot of things that could be going on. We do know that, there's methane and carbon dioxide escaping from the landfill and landfill gas, and there's a lot of other stuff that joins the ride. One of the things that we have observed really smelling strongly is specifically hydrogen sulfide, or H2S. We actually took out a little air monitor that could measure this. And so when people smell the dump day, we use that air monitor to detect H2S. And we found that that was definitely exceeding all of those times what the minimum human nose detection level is. So I can partially answer that one, but there are some unknowns. I don't know if Joel or Mark, you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I would say any volatile organics that are going into the landfill that come out through the top. So, depending on if they've just hauled in a load of contaminated soil, that would mean that gasoline vapors are going out. So there's other things that could be in trace amounts that could be more concerned, but human noses are particularly effective at picking up very small trace odors. Not as good as dogs, but we can pick up a lot of things. So if you smell something that's odd and it has a chemical smell and it doesn't smell like rotten eggs, then that probably means there's something else in there that is more likely to be of chemical origin. It might be a very small amount, but it could be problematic.
All right, another question is does Republic Services and or Benton County have pollution liability insurance for Coffin Butte Landfill?
So I'll answer that question. Yes, as far as we know, the requirement in the 2020 franchise agreement for Valley Landfills to obtain the $10 million pollution liability insurance, as far as we understand, that still is in effect. As I mentioned during my presentation, There is a 30-day notice period where Valley Landfills could choose on their own to inform the county that, in their opinion, pollution liability insurance has gotten too expensive and they will no longer be required to have it. So yes, I think we understand that it is currently in effect. I have not seen a recent policy, but one assumes that it's still in effect.
I tried to see if I could quickly figure this one out and put it in chat, but I couldn't. How does the Bridgeton landfill volume compare to the current volume at Coffin Butte? This may be something we have to get back to you on.
I don't know, but I that is an interesting question. It's one that I should know, because when we talk about the comparisons, we have to get a sense of scale. The Bridgeton landfill it's been burning for years. That's one of the other issues related to the Bridgeton landfill. There's a landfill fire deep in that landfill that they have been unsuccessful in putting out. I think it's been burning for more than 10 years. But that is a good question that we will have to get the answer to, because I think it's important to understand the scale when we're doing those comparisons.
I'm going to kind of tackle a couple of questions that I'm going to loop together under big umbrella and then pass it around to Joel and Mark to add anything. You know, the question ultimately is where does the garbage go? What are the alternatives? So we stop the landfill. What happens next? I'm going to partially answer some of that question. Lane County recently passed legislation. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but they made a plan and a commitment to build an integrated materials and energy recovery facility. We call it IMERF. And what IMERF is supposed to do is take the garbage that arrives from waste haulers and then sort it and make sure that everything gets reused, recycled, or reduced as much as possible. So in the case of food waste and other organic materials, this is put into a hermetically sealed anaerobic environment, which efficiently captures near 100% of the methane and then repurposes it for another use, such as fuel or natural gas in people's homes or straight generation of electricity. So there are ways that we can dramatically reduce the amount of garbage going into Coffin Butte and other landfills by sorting out the waste before it ends up in there. Joel and Mark also mentioned electronic waste and pesticides and tons of things that shouldn't get into the landfill. Currently, Coffin Butte doesn't have a policy or a set of tools or really anything to verify or remove dangerous waste before it ends up in the landfill. So facilities like IMERFs mitigate some of these issues and ensure that we aren't sending garbage that could be turned into soil or other useful products into a landfill where it gets buried forever, and instead we reuse or repurpose those materials. So that dramatically reduces some of the issues. Some of the other ideas that were brought up tonight are upstream solutions. You know, we mitigate the production of some of these things to begin with. And I won't speak too much to those, but single-use plastic and excessive packaging is a serious problem that can be addressed and reduced in a variety of ways. But some of the larger things going into landfills, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the number one or two source is food waste. So if we start diverting food waste and turning that into soil and other useful things, that's immediately a huge low-hanging fruit that we can address, and that states like California are already in the process of doing so. So we can follow up and instigate some of those actions ourselves at a county or at a state level. And then, you know, Joel, you have a lot of experience with international waste management, and I'm curious if you have anything to share.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It is really the question that we ought to be talking about right now. You know, the county has this SMMP process, Sustainable Materials Management process, and you know, what's the old saying? You know, the time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. Well, the time to close the landfill was probably 30 years ago too. In fact, that was the plan back in the 1970s, that it would be closed by 2000, but there was not action on it. But now we're left with that same question: what do we do? And there are a number of things that could be done. Transfer stations are the sort of the easiest solution, but it's important to recognize that countries in other places, they've actually dealt with this already, and they've come up with solutions. So I mentioned I've worked in Sweden. I work with Finland a lot. In Sweden, they have actually eliminated landfills for municipal waste already. There's no, they have used incineration as one of the alternatives, but it's a much that creates its own concerns, but it's a more highly regulated type of incineration they do in the EU. In Finland, they're actually planning to go to a fully circular economy by 2050. That's a national initiative. And the key thing, as Mason pointed out, is that separating the waste upstream is really the key to all the places that have done this. I could mention Denmark, Germany, as other places. And what we do in the United States right now, all too often, we've said, well, people won't really make the effort to sort out their waste. So we have something called commingled pickup, which ends up being a mess to deal with. It's hard to sort out in the end. There's whether there's glass mixed in or not, there's still a lot of things that initially were separate materials, but now they're all lumped together, and there's so it ends up creating limits on how that can be processed. The countries that do it better start higher up with the consumers, and also with businesses that generate waste, and sort things out at the top end. And that really is probably where we need to be headed in this country eventually. There's a certain amount of resistance, and certainly the current garbage collection industry in this country is built around throwing everything pretty much into one bin. And that is billed as being a cheaper solution, but it's not necessarily the cheapest solution when you consider the long-term environmental costs. And one thing that when we don't factor in the environmental costs of these landfills, it ends up looking like landfills are the cheapest way to do it. But in fact, it turns out these other ways where they're sorting out materials, they actually can generate revenue from this in some cases. That's turned out to fund the whole operation. So there are other ways to do it. The best thing is sorting upstream and then limiting the amount you have to deal with. Getting the organics out, as Mason mentioned, is really important to minimize methane generation, and diverting that to other facilities, and then taking all the toxics and the metals out of the stream too, that cause other types of contamination, e-waste. Once those things are done, then you have a much less hazardous thing. You can even reduce it down to sometimes, in some cases, I think in Hamburg, Germany, they've got it down to about 10% of the total waste stream ends up going to what they call a thermal treatment process, a sort of more advanced incineration process. So it's doable, but we need to get started now. What we see in Lane County is a good first step in that direction, in my view.
Yeah, if I can just throw in a couple of thoughts, random thoughts. One is that throwing away your garbage is very cheap, and it's because we're not looking at the long-term life cycle cost of the liability of hosting this landfill. So people want to keep their garbage rates low. Well, ultimately, our kids or grandkids are going to end up paying for this cheap approach that we're taking now. The other thing is that, and I think we all know this, but here are some statistics regarding waste generation in the United States. In 1960, on per capita, there was 2.68 pounds per person being generated, and the population in 1960 was 179 million people. Today, in 2018, it's up to 4.9 pounds per person, and the population in 2020 was 331 million. So we are just generating massive quantities of waste, and it just requires a new perspective on what's happening or what the consequences are for all the waste that we generate.
All right. So let's switch to leachate and PFAS for just a second. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One's a speculative question, and Mark, perhaps you can speak your efforts around here. Do we know if the Corvallis wastewater, I think the question was meant to be phrased as, would refuse or charge the landfill operator a higher amount for leachate given the new requirements for cleanup? And then another related question is, should residents in Adair Village be drinking their water? I would encourage you all to go view your local water quality report, which does have safe findings in terms of PFAS and the forever chemicals we were referring to. We do know that the Oregon Health Authority has tested for some of these PFAS chemicals at 10 parts per trillion. The new just created drinking water standard a few weeks ago is at 10 parts per trillion for some of these molecules and 4 parts per trillion for others. So the short answer is that yes, we think it's safe, but there does need to be some more refined testing to ensure it is up to the EPA's new standards.
So I'll take the question about the Corvallis wastewater treatment plant. Just to let folks know, I've testified before the Corvallis City Council twice, maybe 3 times, about their willingness to continue to accept this leachate material from the landfill. First, you need to know that they get paid $1 million a year, and if they stop receiving the leachate, then I think their perspective is they've got to find another source to replace that lost revenue. The bottom line is that even if the landfill paid Corvallis $10 million a year, it's not going to result in any cleaner water being discharged to the Willamette River. The Corvallis wastewater treatment plant, as is most wastewater treatment plants, they are conventional wastewater treatment plants that do not have the technology or the capability to remove these toxic pollutants. So there is a lot of research work being done. Instead of shielding the landfill from the real cost of treating the leachate, they should be required to install their own treatment facilities at the landfill in order to remove the pollutants. I am going to be returning to the Corvallis City Council soon because just recently, in the last few days, EPA has declared that PFAS and its related chemicals have now been designated as hazardous materials. So not only is it dangerous from lots of different fronts, but now there's this added liability for the Corvallis wastewater system to be accepting these hazardous materials into their treatment plants. And so I'm going to be returning back to the Corvallis City Council, imploring them to stop this practice.
Okay, give me just a second. We have another question in here, and we're getting towards the end. Kind of asking, how do counties discern if they ship their waste to Benton County over other landfills? Kind of, do we know why Pierce County did it? And does our landfill have stricter or more relaxed rules about what trash we take than other landfills? Yeah, I'll let you two take that one.
I'll start.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Joel, because I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, I think, on paper, the landfill is only supposed to accept municipal solid waste. But the problem is that there's actually no inventory of what's coming in. The trucks come up there, they back up to the tipping face, they dump them out, and there's no one there actually checking and sampling those loads to see what's there. It's self-reporting is what it's all about, and we know that all kinds of things there have been news stories about things showing up in the landfill that we wouldn't want to have anywhere. And so those one suggestion that people have raised is that there actually should be a sampling system or an inventory or a audit system for waste coming in, periodic audits of just loads to see what's coming in there. And then we would know. But right now, there are no real controls.
Yeah, they aren't controlling. The bottom line is it's all about economics. And Republic Services is actively recruiting for more waste to come here. And the way they do that is by undercutting the tipping fees at other landfills. So Pierce County, for example, either they are allowed to dump things here that they can't dump in Washington. We don't have any evidence of that because we, again, as Joel pointed out, there are no audits of the waste that's coming into the landfill. And remember that there, by Valley Landfill's own reporting, there are 128,000 vehicles coming to this landfill every year. So the ability for them to screen it would take an effort. But again, I think we all know that people's disposal practices are less careful than they should be, and so the counties make their decisions based on tipping fees, and all of that information is proprietary information. So we don't have access to any of that information. We don't know how much they're charging Klamath County or Douglas County because they don't have to share that information with us anymore. Back in the 90s, they did, but we're not privy to that information. So I think it's about economics. It might also be about less stringent requirements or less stringent review of the types of materials that are actually being dumped into this landfill.
Right, thank you. I think we've covered the content tonight. A lot of questions I tried to answer in chat. A further question is kind of, how do we get involved, until we know an expansion is coming? And the short answer is get educated, just as you are tonight. I know you can go to Beyond Toxics and subscribe to our email alerts, where we will alert when there is an expansion and provide a testimony guide on how to testify for that. So you can make your voice heard then. There are plenty of zero waste movements and wonderful things that you can do at home on a small scale, such as composting in both Eugene and Corvallis. Putting your food scraps in a yard waste bin is a really super simple way to start. And yeah, I'd open it up to you two to add anything else.
Yeah, well, I would just say, no, go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, I wanted to put in a plug for Beyond Toxics as an organization that's really doing educational. So getting on the newsletter for that would be good. And also showing up. We have these county commissioner meetings that aren't really well attended. They don't hear from a lot of people. So going in and talking to them and letting them know you're concerned. If you live not right in the county, you may not get listened to, but you may still have legislators you can talk to. We do know that quite a few state legislators are really starting to get concerned about these issues. And the more they hear from their constituents, the more likely they are to actually do something.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that, getting involved is a key. You don't have to show up and testify. You can write letters. You also need to be demanding accountability. We have a county commissioner election that's happening right now. And so part of the future of this county will be determined by who gets elected as county commissioner. So think carefully about your vote. You as a public member need to demand better accountability out of the folks who do have the ability to have an influence on what the future of this landfill site will be.
Right. With that, we're going to conclude tonight. If you have further questions or want more information on the question you already asked, Crystal's going to put all of the panelists' contact information in chat. You're also welcome to email info@beyondtoxics.org. And with that, thank you all so much for your attendance
Hey,
and for
Mason?
being. Yes.
Hey, Mason, one other thing. There was somebody asked a question about how can they access the recording.
Oh, thank you. We are going to post the recording on YouTube, so you can search Beyond Toxics and go from there on YouTube. You can also go to our website where it will be. It might be 2 to 3 days, so give us a bit. And we'll also send up a follow-up email. All of you registered with us, we'll send a follow-up email with our suggested resources, our contact information, and a link to the recording once it's uploaded.
I'd just like to say thanks everyone for your time and great questions this evening. We can do this if we work together.
Yeah, likewise, thanks. I can see there's a lot of people already thinking about the issues and coming up with creative questions and ideas, and that's what we need more of. And as I said, the sooner we start to work on this problem together, the sooner we'll get to a solution.
All right. With that, I appreciate those notes of optimism at the end, and we'll wrap up for this evening. Thank you all.
Thanks, Mason. Thank you, Crystal.
Thanks, Mason, Crystal, everybody.